I'm going to give you everyone a quick rundown here before we start. Please be sure to mute your microphones and keep your cameras off unless you are presenting. There will be, if anyone asking, there will be a PDF of this presentation online afterwards when we host the video. So, as I said, I am Joe Aiello. We are going to be kicking off with Sean Jeans Gale, our VP of Policy and Government Affairs. He will be talking about the incoming Congress and what it means for transportation. Then after him, we will be joined by Ann Canby. She is the director for the One Rail Coalition, which the Rail Passengers is a member. At one time, she was between 93 and 2001, she was the Delaware Secretary of Transportation. So she should have a pretty interesting insight to an administration being headed by the former senator from her home state of Delaware. After that, we'll have a Q&A. Both Ann and Sean will be joined by our Rail Passengers President and CEO, Jim Matthews, and that'll be moderated by our Communications Manager, Maddie Butler. After that, I will come back and wrap everything up. So without further ado, I present Sean Jeans Gale.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm hoping we're going to have a pretty interesting conversation here. A lot of things to go over. It's been a fairly chaotic and extended election season, so I'm just going to jump right into it. So today we're going to cover three main tranches, which is we'll look at the Senate, the control of which is yet to be decided and is waiting on the outcome of two special runoff races on January 5th in Georgia, and what that means for President-elect Biden's ability to influence infrastructure. We'll look at the House of Representatives, where the House Democratic majority erodes, setting up a fairly interesting conversation between centrists and progressives, and what that means for the House GOP, which is already eyeing a run on the majority in 2022 during the midterms. And we'll look at some key legislative opportunities and hurdles on the legislative calendar in 2021, which include a lot of budgeting issues, a lot of a potential COVID-19 response package, which would be very important to restoring daily service. And of course, the Surface Transportation Reauthorization, which we made great strides in the House this year, but kind of fell short on the Senate side. And so we're going to have to readdress it. So we'll begin with the Senate. As you can see, the margins are razor thin here. Democrats currently have 48 seats, Republicans 50. I think the Republicans have the slight advantage in the polls. However, pollsters haven't had the greatest cycle. So I think we're going to kind of wait and see what the voters of Georgia have to say, let the votes be counted. Broadly speaking, we can kind of look at the two different possible outcomes and make some predictions about the trends. And the first one is, so if the Republicans win just one of the Georgia seats, Mitch McConnell remains majority leader, Republicans retain control of the House. That probably does not bode well for a major infrastructure push out of the Congress. It's been a key priority for the Biden administration during the election. However, Senator McConnell, along with some very key committee heads, including Senator Wicker out of Mississippi, who heads Senate Commerce, has indicated they're not really interested in a big standalone package for infrastructure. There's not a lot of political incentive there to give the Biden administration a win right out of the gate. And so any infrastructure that happened would likely happen through regular order, which is the FY 2022 appropriations package, along with that, the aforementioned Surface Transportation Reauthorization. It also, Senate Republican control of the Senate also probably does not bode well for a COVID-19 relief package. Senator McConnell has kind of set the roof for his interest in that at around $500 billion. It would be focused with a package focused mainly on payroll protection program extension, targeted relief at businesses. There's no real clear room or well-defined role for infrastructure there. That's going to be very concerning, not just for Amtrak long distance passengers, but also state supported, the Northeast Corridor. And then, of course, there are dozens of transit systems right now that are facing some very severe financial pressures as a result of the ridership decline from this pandemic. So, I think Republican control, you can just broadly say it's going to result in a much narrower kind of spectrum of outcomes in terms of big, bold infrastructure packages. If Democrats win both seats in Georgia, it's a 50-50 tie, and then the tiebreaking vote goes to Vice President Harris. So in this scenario, Democrats have control of the trifecta, which is the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. However, by the narrowest of margins, and certainly when you look at the people they have in the caucus, including Senator Manchin out of West Virginia, who's a very conservative member of the Democratic caucus. Again, you're not going to see a huge amount of probably deficit expanding infrastructure packages. The interesting thing is there will be a power sharing agreement necessary in a 50-50 scenario. You can't reseat committee chairs until that power sharing agreement is in place, and it's unclear what kind of leverage each party would have in terms of brokering such a structure. So that's gonna be a very interesting, very chaotic outcome. We will cross that bridge when we get to it, but again, we're just gonna have to wait till January 5th to find out. There was a number of notable Senate retirements and defeated incumbents, along with some notable re-elections. We're going to highlight some names here. Unfortunately, we lost Senator Pat Roberts and Senator Tom Udall to retirement. We also lost Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado to defeat by his challenger, Governor Hickenlooper of Colorado. All three of those names should be very familiar. They were part of our Southwest Chief Coalition and were very important bipartisan voices for Amtrak's national network. That doesn't mean the people replacing them won't also support the national network, but it does mean we're going to have a big job of educating them and letting them know, bringing them up to speed. So that gives you kind of a preview of what we're going to be doing in the first quarter of 2021. Some notable re-elections. We saw Senator Susan Collins, who is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Transportation, fend off a challenge from Sarah Gideon. It ended up not being that close, but that's notable because Senator Collins has been a staunch defender of Amtrak, specifically state-supported corridors and Tiger. She's a big fan of the Downeaster, and we look forward to working with her in future appropriation cycles. We've also seen Senator Steve Daines, who is a big advocate of the empire built on the national network, hold off a challenge from Governor Bullock in Montana. So there's still, again, there's a lot kind of hinging on those two Georgia seats, but we'll have some familiar faces to work with. Regarding the House of Representatives, we saw something interesting happen down ballot, which was in places where President-elect Biden performed fairly well. We saw a lot of the centrist Democratic members who came in on the blue wave get carried right back out on another red wave. So it was not entirely expected. It's going to create some interesting tensions within the Democratic caucus. Speaker Nancy Pelosi is expected to hold on to her leadership role of the Democratic caucus in the House. The elections will be this week, so we'll find out. But there's going to be a lot of tension between the progressive wing, which actually added seats, and the more centrist wing, which has control of leadership. That will be interesting for our issue because the progressives are going to push towards for a very aggressive climate change package. Obviously, passenger rail is a very important tool, passenger rail and transit, very important tool in reducing carbon emissions. It's an energy efficient, environmentally friendly way to get around the country and get around the city. And so we would stand to benefit from an aggressive climate change bill. Whether the Democrats can unify behind that is a big question mark. Speaker Pelosi will have the eventual House Majority Leader will have a 5 to 6 seat margin. That's not a lot. There are some significant bills that were passed out of the 116th Congress, including HR 2, which was the Moving America Forward Act, which had about maybe 10 to 15 House Democratic defections. So, how that plays out in terms of legislation, it's something to keep an eye on. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was reelected yesterday, so he will retain control of the House GOP caucus. And we have yet to see what kind of strategy they're going to approach in the 117th. I think there's going to be a lot of incentive for them to kind of sit back and let Democrats fight. They're probably already thinking ahead to the 2022 midterm elections, where the party control of the White House historically loses seats. But we've also seen situations where, certainly in the past, where, let's say, the House Democrats as a minority, with John Boehner controlling the House GOP caucus, they end up playing spoiler between him and the Tea Party wing. So we could see some interesting things develop, something to keep an eye on. There will be continuity at the top of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I think that's a good thing. Representative Peter DeFazio out of Oregon did a very good job with HR 2, which was the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill. Had a very strong passenger rail component, included $55 billion across 5 years. So we look forward to something similar coming out of the committee this year. We'll also see Representative Graves return to his role as ranking member. There will be some turnover at the subcommittee level for rail and pipelines. Current chair Dan Lipinski out of Illinois was defeated in his primary today. There was a hearing on the Surface Transportation Board reauthorization. That will be his last committee hearing as head. And we have a couple challengers who we've identified. They include Representatives Sires, Garamendi, Payne, and Malinowski, among a few others. So there's a big New Jersey block there. Obviously, when you live in New Jersey, you're on the corridor. Your constituents are served by New Jersey Transit. There's a big incentive to head up that committee. Garamendi represents Davis and Fairmount outside of Sacramento. And so, but also commuter rail, big in his district, and intercity rail as well. So I think these are a couple good candidates, and we'll wait to see who comes out on top. For the appropriations, there is a three-way campaign for gavel. The current chairwoman, Nita Lowey, out of New York, is retiring. So Marcy Kaptur, Rosa DeLauro, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz are currently in a three-way race. This is a very powerful committee that controls the year-to-year spending across all 12 appropriations bills. Kaptur has seniority. I believe Representative DeLauro is relatively close with Speaker Pelosi. And so we'll see who comes out on top, but that's going to be something to keep an eye on as we figure out what their priorities were. Chairman Lowey was very much a strong supporter of passenger rail, and so we hope that whoever her successor is continues in that tradition. I'm going to turn real briefly to ballot measures here. which saw mixed results for passenger rail and transit. I know a lot of elected officials were very wary of this cycle in regards to its potential for advancing bond measures or tax measures. There's a lot of people out of work, a lot of people experiencing financial insecurity. And so it's a tough time to go to voters and ask for a tax increase, even if it is for something they value, like expanded rail. We did see some key wins. Measure RR passed in California, in the Bay Area specifically. It was a tri-county measure. And Caltrain was facing a COVID-19 induced fiscal crisis. They saw ridership go off a cliff and a lot of their revenue as well. And so now this has been a long-term goal for Caltrain, a dedicated source of funding. It put them on some very secure financial footing. So we're very pleased about that. Austinites overwhelmingly passed Proposition A, which is going to greenlight $7 billion in investment in light rail and other transit systems across Austin, which desperately needs it. They've tried to get this passed a number of times. So again, we're pretty happy for all the advocates who worked on that, including some of our members. We also saw some notable failures. Multnomah County, which is the Portland, Oregon region, the voters shot down by a fairly wide margin a regional transportation plan. It included one key light rail extension, but was actually very broadly focused on transportation as a whole and included roads and bridges. Gwinnett County Transit Referendum, which would have added BRT, bus service, and extended a existing MARTA line, lost by a very slim margin. I think it ended up being around 3,000 or 4,000 votes. So it's hard to extrapolate what that means. Generally, these ballot measures do very well, but this is a very small sample size, and again, in a very weird electoral environment. So finishing up with my part of the presentation, I just wanted to highlight some key dates on the legislative calendar. As I mentioned, this week there will be House leadership elections. McCarthy has already been reelected. For the Republican side, we'll find out who the Democrats elect later this week. December 11th, which is the next notable date, the current continuing resolution, which is the budget extension that had kept the government open. That's going to expire. The Senate right now is working on the FY21 appropriations bills. The House has already passed theirs. I expect it to be fairly clean extension of current budget law and funding levels, which is a shame because we would have liked to use it as a vehicle to restore daily service. But I think there's going to be a lot of incentives just to get this thing done so that they don't have any more legislative deadlines to face before the Christmas break. December 14th, the Electoral College will meet and vote on our president. That should be fairly non-controversial, although we all saw the news coming out of Michigan yesterday. January 3rd, 2021, 117th Congress officially convenes. January 5th, we'll see that Georgia Senate runoff election, and that will have a big impact on the next 4 years. January 20th, the presidential inauguration. That'll be where President-elect Joe Biden becomes President Joe Biden, and we'll start seeing the first 100 days implemented. At some point, and I got to put some question marks here, but we would like to see a COVID-19 supplemental funding bill. I don't think we'll see it before the end of this year, so that puts it early next year. I think we'll get something. I don't think it will be the $2 trillion to $3 trillion package outlined by the House Democrats earlier in 2020. Senator McConnell has indicated he'd be willing to consider something around the 500 million level, and it would be targeted pretty specifically at businesses like the payroll protection program. I do not know what kind of room there is for infrastructure, but I do know that the need is great, obviously. We talk a lot about Amtrak here, but again, dozens of transit systems around the US are facing extreme financial pressure. So we're going to try to use that as the vehicle to get relief to them. And then, of course, we have the regular order. So September 30th, we'll see the expiration of the 1-year extension of the surface transportation law. And then also on that same day, expiration of FY 2021. So we have a lot of work starting in February with the reauthorization, with the transportation appropriations. There's a lot of needs that we have to meet. And so it's going to be a very busy year. We'll talk more about this during the Q&A, but also in this next section where Ann Canby, the director of One Rail, will talk about what Amtrak Joe means for rail. So pleased to have her here. She's native of Delaware, as Joe mentioned. She served on the cabinet of multiple governors, including as the Commissioner of Transportation in New Jersey and as the Delaware Secretary of Transportation. She's also served as the treasurer of the MBTA and as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the US DOT. She brings a wealth of experience to this conversation. She's currently the director of the One Rail Coalition, a group she founded to bring together stakeholders from all over the rail industry, including freight, intercity passenger, commuter, rail labor, rail suppliers, and even passenger advocates. So thank you for joining us, Ann. And I'm just going to begin by asking this question. A lot of conversation that happens after election is centered around what the first 100 days of an administration is going to be like, what an administration can do on day one in terms of regulatory and executive orders. So I just wanted to kind of begin, like, what do you see the first 100 days of a Biden administration looking like, given the kind of uncertainty in Congress?
Great, Sean. Thanks so much. Great to join all of you today. Great to be able to speak with members of a One Rail member. And before I get into Sean's question, let me just tell you a couple of things that we've been up to make sure you are aware. You saw the link to Facebook on the previous slide, but we are active on social media as One Rails. We try and get more information out there about rail investments, about state fact sheets for rail, benefits of rail, which I think will be all helpful to everybody trying to advance the cause of rail. And we'll get you, in addition to Facebook, the Twitter and LinkedIn connections as well, for those of you who are interested and who may not already be signed up. Another thing we did this fall, which I think will be very helpful going forward as well, is to do a poll, which we came out with in September during United for Infrastructure Week. And I think the results are quite encouraging. First, 75% of those polled agreed that we ought to be shifting more trips to intercity rail and transit. So that's a very encouraging number, and particularly in context of dealing with climate, which we all recognize, I think, is going to be a major initiative of a new Biden administration. Next, about almost 2/3, 65%, had a very favorable view of intercity rail post-pandemic, higher than even before the pandemic, which was about 59%. That was sort of interesting to me, that it was higher post-pandemic than prior. Next, about half, 47% or so, think we ought to be investing more in passenger rail, which is a good number. And finally, the 81%, over 3/4, thinks that Congress ought to be providing more funding for rail safety, grade crossing safety, particularly because about 95% of all the rail-related deaths are either at a crossing or somebody trespassing. So we think those are good handles to use when you all, as well as everybody in One Rail, reaches out. And we will be doing our usual meetings with new members of Congress. And that'll be part of the story we'll be telling them. In terms of a Biden administration, I think there's no doubt that we know my former senator and our former vice president and our to-be president, is very favorable to rail. I think we also probably need to recognize that he's going to have a whole lot of issues on his plate. And so while he is favorable to rail, we're going to have to make sure that people who work around him also have that same message and are willing to put their words and sentiments into action. Some of the things that I think from an executive order standpoint that we can hope for and likely may expect are the restoration of the deal between the federal government, New York and New Jersey regarding the Gateway project, getting the environmental documents approved and starting to move on that project. That's one thing I would expect we would see happen. Another, I think that's fairly likely could be the rescinding the clawback of the high-speed rail grant to California. And so that those two things I think can be pretty sure. Some other things that I think we ought to be giving some thought to are, one, how to make sure rail is part of everything to do with climate from this administration. There's been a lot of talk of doing a climate council government-wide. And so I think we want to make sure that rail is a part of all of that and thinking about ways that it can be. Some of the things that I identify, I guess based on the various slots that I've occupied in my life, are, one, making sure that rail is indeed part of the solution. I mean, the meetings we've had John Bakari talk to One Rail a couple of months ago, and he said, when there is a recovery package, rail will be a very prominent part of it. So we want to make sure, A, that happens, should there be a recovery package. I'm not sure we know about that right now. But I think there's some other things that can happen. In the grant programs where there's flexibility in terms of the federal share, often the language says shall be up to 80%, which means quite often it's never anywhere close to that for rail programs. So that's one of the things that we might want to look at to say, okay, folks, let's make sure that rail is treated on an equal plane with other modes. And I would say that same thing goes for public transit, the capital improvement grant program, which often does not ever get to 80% federal share. So why should highways get 80, 90, or 100, and these other modes that we so desperately need more of be disadvantaged in that regard? So that's one thing I think is worth definitely thinking about. I think also the administration can direct the Department of Transportation to examine all of the guidance that goes out to grantees and wrap in climate factors, all of which I think are helpful to rail, and the administration can help point out how that is the case, whether it's commuter rail, transit within a region, or connecting cities, because we all know that short haul air trips are way more producing greenhouse gases than a rail trip. So there are things like that that I think get burrowed down into the workings of government that can really help push the rail thinking along. Looking for ways to maximize what exists in the way of flexibility in programs under the highway title, I think is another place where there's some opportunities, whether it's the surface grant program or the CMAQ program in particular on the passenger rail side. I think those are another thing that could be launched, I think, that would be helpful over the longer term for rail and transit, is to really get serious about figuring out how to do fare integration. We talked about it when I was in Delaware some 20 plus years ago, of having all the transit systems and Amtrak all have the same, at least interoperable fare systems. We have it on the highway side, on the tolls. So why not get that together on the transit side as well? Another thing that might be helpful, and I'm sure we'll see some of this from this administration, would be very strongly looking at the Buy America requirements. The Vice President has promised to really help build American jobs. So there's a lot of good rail jobs if we can get an industry going. So that's another avenue I think that's worth pursuing. Those are just a few of the ideas on the executive side. There'll be, I think, a lot of broader initiatives, which once we see what they are, we can figure out how to wrap in rail as a part of the solution to whatever the problem may be, whether it's job creation, the equity issues, climate I talked about. I think there's a number of opportunities, and Build Back Better plan. Clearly, rail is a part of that. So clearly, the other thing that I would point out is that this incoming administration certainly, and maybe unfortunately, but they have experience in dealing with a Congress that is not totally of the same party. So figuring out how to get things done, at least they have some idea what they're up against, and how this relationships are all going to play out. We'll just have to wait and see. But fortunately, they're not new to this game. So that I think is helpful in trying to figure it all out. Legislatively, Sean mentioned, I think there's three paths to watch. One is appropriations, second is reauthorization, and third is Recovery Act, if there is such a thing. And appropriations, I think, is probably at this juncture, where we stand right now, what we know, the most likely place for us to focus our attention, at least early on, for robust funding for rail. And I would add that with RPA being right in the middle of it, we've worked hard with other members to make sure that Amtrak and the transit crowd got the funding. We've got one step in the CARES Act, and we're still figuring out how to get the next tranche done. But we've been very active working with people on the Hill to try and make sure that funding is in there once and whenever they do get around to doing something about that. Some very depressing news earlier today from MTA about if they don't get funding, what may happen in terms of service cuts and job cuts. So that's, hopefully that will wake up some people. So I think that's clearly where we will focus initially our efforts. Now, recovery, again, as Sean pointed out, we'll have to see where we end up and what A, the administration puts together, and B, where we stand with the Congress in terms of doing that. If there should be one, I think that we can be fairly certain that rail will be a part of it. And my guess is that it would be wrapped around climate, a lot of it. And if there is one that comes forward, I think one of our efforts has to be to get a big slug of funding, as much as we possibly can, because who knows when reauthorization is going to happen. And I'll come to that in a minute. Another idea that comes to my mind is there an opportunity to try and put in place a multi-year funding arrangement? We've talked about in our reauthorization proposals, sustainable long-term funding. Well, hooking it to the trust fund may be hard in the initial stages, and I'll come back to that in a minute as well. But is there a way to think about an initial step of long-term funding that gives longer-term funding, I should say, that gives some certainty to the ability of Amtrak and the states that are trying to expand services to be able to know what they can expect? I mean, they have it on the highway side for sure. And why can't we start that on that path in some fashion? So I think that's an opportunity we ought to give some more thought to. And secondly, or thirdly, maybe, is figuring out how to fund the current programs in a Recovery Act. I think that using what's already authorized or on the books and putting money in those pots is probably the easiest way to get something through in a Recovery Act. So those are the things in recovery. We'll just have to see how it shapes out. There are going to be a lot of things on the list, whether it's broadband or you name it, school buildings. I mean, there's going to be just a whole long list. So we'll have to fight to make sure we have a seat at the table, as infrastructure always does. People talk about it, and then it somehow doesn't always get as much attention as we would like. We saw that, I think, a bit in the ARA efforts a number of years ago. In terms of reauthorization, well, the challenge is we all know what it's like to get a bill reauthorized. And I don't think it'll be any easier this time when you think about having to put in place a new administration and get it staffed up so they have time to figure out what they want to put in a bill. and then figuring out what the congressional situation is, and then all the other things that are happening, such as the lifting the debt ceiling issues are going to come up in the fall. There's going to be a whole bunch of stuff out there that's just going to create confusion and challenges that we would rather not have to deal with. But One Rail has come together earlier this year, as I said a moment ago, for sustainable long-term funding, for more consistent treatment. I mentioned that federal share funding increases when they plus up on the appropriation side, make sure everybody gets an equal share, ensuring that folks who for the Highway Trust Fund are paying their full share. There's been a huge transfer of general fund revenues to the trust fund, which puts rail at a huge disadvantage because it does not recognize the full costs of the road network. Safety, we want to make sure the grade crossing program stays as a separate funding source, and that the match gets raised to 100% like the regular highway program has. And then also expanding eligibility to include obsolete warning devices, and also increase the incentive payments to localities to close crossings, which would help the safety issue as well. And we want to make sure Amtrak's eligible for the Tiger program so that it can compete in that arena as well. So those are some of the things that I think from a reauthorization, legislative recovery or reauthorization and appropriations that we ought to be thinking about. Our plates will be very full, that's for sure. And figuring out which way to go is a challenge we're all going to have.
And if I can just, we've received a lot of, I would say, an unusual amount of press inquiry and public attention to the Amtrak issue as a result of quote unquote Amtrak Joe heading to the White House. He obviously was on a whistle stop tour, drawing attention to Amtrak. Do you see any way to leverage this Amtrak Joe persona, the fact that his love of trains is very well known among the general public, to leverage increased support for spending? Or conversely, do you see any danger in the Democratic president being so closely associated with a single program, and the potential for maybe a reactionary backlash from Republicans who want to deny their political opponent a victory, a signature win?
Who knows how the Republicans will behave. But I would say, everybody recognizes that Joe is a fan of Amtrak and passenger trains in general. I think one of the key leverages is the rail labor community, with whom he's very close and has longstanding relationships. I think he knows everybody who has worked on the Northeast Corridor for a number of years. So that's one key constituency. I think looking at other constituencies that he considers important, whether it's seniors, veterans, others where they can also raise their voice and make sure, even though we know he pays and cares a lot about it, my concern is that they get overwhelmed with all the issues they have to deal with, not just domestically, but also the international front as well. And so I think that's something we're going to just have to, we know we have a friend, but we got to give him and make sure he knows he has enough allies to get stuff done. He cannot do it on his own. So we need to have lots of voices in there, both at the White House and then also on the Hill, making sure we're doing something we know he would like to have. I think that's the way we might want to look at it.
Well, next month's webinar, we will be talking with a number of rail labor groups about potential opportunities for leverage, for building off each other's work, supporting passenger rail, and also the limitations. So we hope everyone joins us for that. Thank you, Anne. That was very informative. We're gonna transition, I believe, as I'm looking at my watch, to the Q&A portion. A number of you submitted questions ahead of time, and I think we can go to them now. So this one, ask, I think, a very important question is, we know Amtrak Joe can't do it all, and we'll be joined by the way, by Jim Matthews, President and CEO of Rail Passengers. We know Amtrak Joe can't do it all on his own. How does the makeup of Congress hinder or help, I would add in there, what we advocates are fighting for? And Jim, why don't we have you jump into the fray here?
Okay, thanks, Sean. And before I start, Ann, thank you so much for being here. Just for the benefit of the audience, Ann has been a tremendous mentor and friend in my time here, and take what she says very seriously. Ann is a veteran and a fighter. So thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. So look, it's too early to really provide a definite answer, given that, you know, Georgia is still in the balance. I think if we were all betting folks, we would probably assume that the Georgia thing is going to keep Republicans in the Senate, and we'll wind up with the split that we have now. There is a real danger that a GOP-controlled Senate could obstruct Biden's infrastructure goals, not because they don't believe in the goals. They've been very big fans of infrastructure for a couple of years, but strictly for a sort of short-term calculation around the 2022 midterms and denying the opposition a win. The nice thing is that we have, as an association, we have fostered coalition in the Senate with strong support from Democrats and from Republicans. I don't know how many folks here watched or listened to that Senate Commerce hearing a couple of weeks ago with Bill Flynn testifying. But if you closed your eyes, you would not be able to tell which ones were Republicans and which ones were Democrats. They were locked arms on supporting Amtrak, supporting daily service, supporting the long distance network. So that's a good thing. But it's an open question on whether in the new calculus and with the new landscape, they'd be willing to give President Biden a kind of signature infrastructure victory. The other thing is that, you know, the House Republicans in recent years have kind of gone quiet on using Amtrak as a whipping boy. And that's been a kind of welcome respite, I would say, for at least the last 18 months to 2 years. Will that come back? I'm starting to see a little bit of a sense that maybe House Republicans will start to use that as an attack line again. That would be a shame, because we have had success in developing a bipartisan consensus around the value of passenger rail to the communities they serve. So I would like to think that would continue. We've done a lot of work to get to that point, but that is where I think continued emphasis on this message from all of us in the coalition, and One Rail's been a very big piece of that, by the way. The One Rail members have helped with that. That's going to be pretty important, I think, to try to create a climate in which we can have constructive conversations about the role that rail can play in trying to bring the economy back from the pandemic disaster that we've been in. Ann, I don't know if you want to jump in on that or not.
Well, a little bit, I'll say. I think that one point we ought to keep in mind is that the 2022 elections, there are going to be people running who want to be able to say they've done something. And so the question is, how can the Biden administration figure out what that is with enough people on both sides of the aisle so that we can have some consensus about getting stuff done? I mean, I think I mean, Delaware is such an anomaly in all of this, but nationally, there's a feeling of let's just get back to business. And so maybe that's an opening. I mean, that's the positive side of things. The other side is, as Jim and Sean both alluded to, the Republicans see what they were able to accomplish below the presidential level in this election. And so why not go for it in 22 and take it all? And so that's, you know, that's out there too. But I do think that people do want to get things done, and the public wants to see Congress get things done. So that's the optimistic view, how to figure out how to use that as leverage, it seems to me.
Wow, I could not agree more. I think that's a really important point, that I think that there is almost universal desire among the electorate to please, let's just stop with the gridlock. Let's just please get something done that benefits the country. You see that consistently in surveys, and you can actually divine that from the voting patterns too. I think another interesting thing that I don't think a lot of folks have focused on is in 2022, yes, the House, the Republicans are targeting capitalizing on the likelihood of Democrats losing more seats. But in 2022, there's also 33 Senate seats that are up for grabs. Of those 33 seats, 22 are held by Republicans and 11 by Democrats. Most of them would be considered safe seats. But as we've seen in this last cycle, safe seat doesn't necessarily mean what it used to mean. And I think that there is going to be a desire in around 18 months' time, which is when this is going to become an issue, for people to look back and say, okay, did my guy or did my gal actually do something? Did they get something done, or did they just, wave their hands and posture? So I think Ann's really spot on here, that there is some leverage going into both of those elections if we can capitalize on the desire to get something done.
The challenge is to figure out what that something is and make it be appealing to enough people.
Well, I saw the Wall Street Journal editorial board came out and said infrastructure is that bipartisan thing. So, to the extent that's a bellwether for conservative opinions, hopefully that holds true. Next question: how can we put pressure on the new administration to include more rural voices, specifically for passenger rail? And I don't know if you want to go through this. My first reaction is the Amtrak board is your best avenue forward right now. I think 6 of the 8 seats are up for nomination. The Trump administration put forward some good names, some bad names. I think only one of them really represented a what you would call a rural Amtrak district. But certainly I think there's going to be a big opportunity there for a Biden administration to gather a list of names, and we're our association is also trying to help influence that decision, and put a lot of people who understand what Amtrak means to the small towns and the rural towns that it serves, where it is the dominant form of intercity transportation. I don't know if you see any other. I'm going to open it to the floor here, but I'm not sure if anyone else wants to add on to that.
Well, Sean, I would just say the work that you all have done at RPA, showing the economic benefits for several of the long distance routes, would be a hugely valuable tool. And I would think that reaching out to constituencies who are focused in the rural areas, whether it's the NATO, the Economic Development Organization, or others like that, seniors, I mean, you name it, there are probably plenty, but getting more voices to be tuning in on this issue for transportation. I think the combination of the loss of air service and the climate issues can help put that story together. Another way to try and see whether we can break through or not is with governors of states that have some surface, but it could be a whole lot better. And as they wrestle with some of their own infrastructure challenges and access for their communities to markets maybe outside of their states, how to put together that story so that we just have more of a variety of voices chiming in on the need to not serve just the heavy city pairs, but also to touch the less dense areas of the country as well.
Yeah, I just want to jump in quickly to extend that idea. I think one thing that we have to remember is that, one of the issues in this election was that sort of rural-urban divide. right? I mean, that was just sort of a dominant conversation. Well, all you got to do is look at a map of the national network, and that literally is the urban-rural divide. It literally connects the rural parts of our country to the urban mega regions of our country. If you're looking for a way to try to salve that difficult, painful conversation that we've been having about rural opportunity versus urban opportunity, what a terrific way to do that, right? I mean, it's one of the few transportation issues that really does bridge that divide, and certainly, you see it in Senator Daines' aggressive support for daily service along the High Line in Montana. This is the kind of issue that can be a unifying issue. And frankly, for an incoming administration that is concerned with issues of equity, I think you can make the equity case here as well. That this is about lower income communities with fewer access to opportunities, and so I think an equity angle would also help to bring the rural voices into the conversation.
Thanks, Jim.
Sean, I see a question on the chat box about asking me what we think the vice president thinks about the long distance network. Well, I can tell you a story from Tom Downs when he was the head of Amtrak and was dealing with all of these issues. And he talked to then Senator Biden, who said, "I know how to count. We can't just have the corridor. We need the country." So I think he gets the fact that it's a network and not just one corridor.
That certainly helps, that kind of institutional understanding. I sometimes wonder if some of the management at Amtrak understands that these days, but it's better to have a president understand it. Okay. From Barry, any rumors going around as to who may end up being the Secretary of Transportation when President-elect Joe Biden becomes president? I'm sure we've all heard the same names floated. I don't know if you guys want to take the lead on this one. I've heard Mayor Eric Garcetti out of Los Angeles, his name being floated. I saw an article yesterday, and that was flagged for me by a coworker, saying former Mayor Rahm Emanuel of Chicago, who also worked as chief of staff of the Obama administration. I at that point, I don't have anything reliable in terms of information or intelligence. I think there's probably a little bit of self-promotion in a lot of these stories in terms of placing. That doesn't mean it won't turn true. It just means that whoever ends up as DOT secretary is going to be a politician. They're going to be in front of cameras a lot, and so I'm sure there's a little bit of a campaign going right now. It's also important, just as important, to the policy and the ability of a DOT to effectively administrate a passenger rail program will be some of the personnel below the secretary level. And so we will kind of keep an eye out for who is being tapped for that. I know Mr. Washington out of LA Metro is running the Biden's transportation transition team. And so you might see someone at that level, at the administrator level, get tapped for maybe like a deputy secretary. And they're going to be really important to making sure that the DOT runs well, and that all our favorite programs are administrated effectively.
I have no names to add, but I would just suggest that looking at the past, the transportation secretary appointment from a Democrat has tended to be an elected official at whatever level. I think when you're thinking about who they're going to put in the cabinet, they got to, hit all the buttons of diversity and geography and all that kind of stuff. And so it's too soon, I think, to kind of tell, but I would be fairly certain that it'll be an existing or former elected official in this cabinet seat.
Yeah, and there's also been a tradition of making sure that there's a bipartisan representation. The Trump administration did not do that, but I wouldn't be surprised if the President Biden tried to restore that sense of normalcy. So that ended up being Ray LaHood under the Obama administration. So another thing to keep an eye on.
Transportation tends to come towards the end of the selection process, and sometimes it's what gap is missing, what do we have to fill, kind of a question that they are left with.
Right.
So who knows?
Yeah. And this is our last question. What are the key ways members can support the work of the association through the transitional period? Jim, do you want to take this?
Sure, I'll start, but I'm sure you and Ann could probably add to that. I mean, look, we've been talking about this all afternoon. We know that Joe Biden knows rail, right? I don't think we have to, that's not an education project we need to undertake. But if you go back a few slides, which I won't make you do, and look at the turnover that we've had in the Senate, we lost Cory Gardner. We've picked up some other folks. We are going to have to do a little bit of work to educate some of the incoming members on the value of passenger rail. The good news is we have the tools to do that now. We didn't necessarily have those tools 2 years ago. Now we do. But that education is going to have to take place. One thing I notice on our social media, I'll look on our Facebook page, or Twitter, or something like that, and I see a lot of comments from people that are very partisan. And there's a sort of presumption that Democrats are pro rail and Republicans are anti-rail. And that's not true. That's not true. That is not true, guys. And, I think we have to be a little more thoughtful and recognize that it is not just a simple matter of Democrat and Republican. One of our strongest champions over the years has been Senator Daines. And Senator Gardner, who we just lost in Colorado, he was a strong voice for intercity passenger rail. Senator-elect Hickenlooper, he was more focused on transit when he was running Denver. That doesn't mean he's going to be a problem for passenger rail. He is an unknown quantity, and we're going to have to sit down and try to work with him and with his staff to get him up to speed on the state of rail today in our country, in our coalition. But I would urge all of you out there to look at your congressional districts, look at your senators, and it's time to take up the effort again that I've asked you guys to take up dozens of times in the past few months. We're going to have to educate the incoming members on the value of rail, and we're going to have to educate it not only on a sort of policy level, which is what we can do here in the DC office, explaining the economic benefits and the benefits to the communities and all of those things, but it's important for you as members to call and write and be heard over and over and over again every week if you have to, and make sure that you deliver that message that says, I live here, I vote here, I take these trains, and it's important to me. That's what we need you to do. You can't let up. You can't let up. Cheerful, use our tools, get our data that'll help you. But in the end, these folks are going to want to hear about you and from you about how this affects you. And that's going to be the big issue on our plate here for the next few months.
Let me just second Jim's comments. I mean, members hearing from their constituents is really, really important. We do what we can in Washington, but hearing from people who live in their district, vote for them, contribute to them, regardless of party, is really, really important. So I can't emphasize and second what Jim said enough. He's just right on the money on that one. It's a combination of both hearing from constituents and putting effective work together through various alliances and whatnot in Washington. But those can also stretch back out into districts where you've got a series of combination of people working together on a particular member. We find when we do our what we call 101 introduction meetings, when we have a cross section of One Rail members, and we in the past, we won't be doing it now, have gone to new members' offices, and they're very impressed with the diversity of the One Rail coalition And it does make an impression when Sean is in the room with the labor guys and with the Class 1 railroads and with a short line and with Amtrak and a rail supplier. It does make a difference that all these people can get in the same room together and have a common message. So I think you can do the same kind of effort at the district level or the state level, depending on who your target is.
Sean?
Okay. Well, I'm not going to gild the lily. Those were two really clear, convincing arguments for staying engaged. That brings us to the end of our webinar. Joe or Maddie, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about our merch opportunities, but I want to thank Ann again, thank Jim, and thank everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And we, again, just very much appreciate everyone's attention and work on this important issue.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure to share this with our members and our listeners here today. So it's bit.ly/RPA merch, but you'll be able to check out our limited edition merch there. Every time that you guys purchase something like this, it directly contributes to what we're doing today. So it's a huge way that you can support the advancement of the association. Thanks again for everybody for attending. You can follow along with our future webinar series at Rail Passengers or railpassengers.org.
And once again, thank you everyone for coming. As a quick follow-up to things that Sean and Jim had said, we have our action page on our website, railpassengers.org/savetrains. You can find how to call, write your senator, your representatives, and we have a social media toolkit with some of the facts and figures from what 3X service is costing your community to potential of Facebook and Twitter links for you guys to use. So once again, thank you forever for coming and happy Thanksgiving. Take care.